Welcome to our webinar about Europe post-Merkel, in which our panel will explore Angela Merkel's impact on the EU and how transatlantic politics would look like going forward. This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce, New York. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC, and I will be your host for today's event. To make this program interactive, we encourage you to ask questions, and we will submit them to our moderator. Our panel today will discuss how Germany's political transition will affect the country, Europe, and the transatlantic relationship in general during a time when the international order is in flux. Our experts will explore opportunities for closer collaboration and where the differences need to be bridged. We will also look at the prospects of a renewal of US-European political and economic cooperation and what it will take to generate an increased alignment in global affairs after Angela Merkel, a major player in international affairs, steps off the world stage. Our panel includes Daniel Benjamin. He's the president of the American Academy in Berlin and a former ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism at the United States Department of State. We also have Peter Fischer-Bollin. He's the head of Department Analysis and Consulting at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Anthony Gardner, author and former ambassador to the United States to the European Union. We have Jonathan Hackenbroich, who's the Policy Fellow for Economic Statecraft and the head of the ECFR's Task Force for Protecting Europe from Economic Coercion at the European Council of Foreign Relations. And we have with us Marion van Rentegem. She's a journalist and author of the recent C'était Merkel, and she's the director of the TV documentary Recherche Merkel Desperément, Desperately Seeking Merkel. And with that, I hand over to Daniel, who is moderating today's discussion. Daniel, over to you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And thanks to EACC and to this great group of panelists for coming together today for this really interesting event. So Germany has had its election. It was a fascinating event, bucking global trends. The real action in the election happened in the center, not at the periphery, not at the fringes. The extreme parties, the Alternative for Deutschland, right-wing, somewhat xenophobic party, and the Linke party, the far-left party, saw their influence decline. The AfD got about the same percentage of votes, but overall they seem to have been marginalized considerably. And we are left with the unusual situation that on the one hand, the action was at the center. At the same time, there's been some fragmentation with no parties except for the two largest parties having enough mandates, enough seats to form a coalition by themselves. Those two parties have been linked together by a series of grand coalitions and have decided that they want to part company. Grand coalitions are seen to be bad for business. And so at the moment, we are looking at a social democratic coalition led by Olaf Scholz together with the Greens and the FDP, the Liberals. This will be Germany's first three-party coalition, depending on how you count it, ever, or since the 1950s. There's a bit of a scholarly debate about that on. And that also raises the question of whether this is going to be a strong coalition or, like any three-legged stool, a somewhat uncertain coalition. Lots and lots of promises have been made. I believe we have 300 different people working in 22 different working groups to come up with a coalition agreement. The groups thus far have actually kept their silence quite remarkably. There have been a few leaks about what's going on, but I thought we'd start off by asking what are the prospects for this coalition to in fact come together in the time frame that was promised. Remember, Germany's last election led to an unprecedented amount of negotiation before the the Grand Coalition was finally agreed upon. So I thought I'd start off by asking Peter Fischer-Bollin what his thoughts are about the likelihood of this coalition coming to pass and how long is it going to take?
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a quite interesting question because our system is really complicated on that. We will have the new government in the moment when there is a majority to elect the new Chancellor, a majority of 50+1. So the plan of the three parties negotiating is to have this moment on December 6th, so in the first week of December. And as you already mentioned, they have been quite silent for German situation. I would say very, very silent during the negotiations. But we've seen in the last days some conflicts coming on the light and coming to knowledge of the public. And I think these conflicts have shown that even with a very smart and smooth start of the negotiations, there are conflicts. In that case, it's a very prominent issue for the Greens. They fear not being able to put or to set the climate change issue or the climate change challenge as an issue for the whole government. So they are fighting to set this issue for the whole government and not just for them. And they have already threatened to complicate the negotiations, and they have already mentioned that it's not necessary to have the election of the new Chancellor on December 6th. But my personal expectation is we will have a new government before Christmas, maybe not on December 6th, maybe on December 12th or 13th, but before Christmas.
Okay. Well, we will hold you to that prognostication. It is worth noting for those of you who are fans of political trivia that if it runs on any longer, Angela Merkel could well become the longest-serving German chancellor. She would make that have that achievement. I'm authoritatively told by Jonathan on December 19th. But unlike some people, she is not a great one for record setting, which I think speaks well of her. Jonathan, there have also been some discussions about friction in the coalition negotiations on foreign policy issues, and you're a close student of that. One of those issues, I would say, is very much a matter of interest for Germany's NATO allies and certainly for the United States. Talk to us about the different issues involved in the nuclear sharing debate, if you would, and whether you think that this is going to be resolved without, too much breaking of crockery.
Thanks a lot, Dan, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, there's a number of issues on European policy and talk about fiscal rules and so forth, and on foreign policy. Foreign policy is not playing a big. I mean, I think this has gotten to everyone by now. It's not been playing a big role in the elections, and is not incredibly important in these coalition negotiations. So I think wherever you find issues of disagreement, I think there won't be the issues that will make or break this coalition ultimately. I think on nuclear sharing, there's a few doubts within the Social Democrats especially, and we've seen that at least in wider issues on defense, that the Greens are questioning the 2% as well of defense spending of GDP. So we may, I think ultimately, in the end on all of these issues, my sense is that we will see Germany take a very similar position as in the past, but maybe with a slightly different rhetoric. Is my ultimate sense on this.
Right. And just to explain, nuclear sharing means that there are U.S. nuclear weapons stationed on German territory, and German planes, Air Force planes, Luftwaffe planes, could be called into action to deliver them. God forbid anything like that would ever happen. And there is, of course, a significant faction, particularly in the SPD, which would just like to end this policy. And Tony, I know that your extraordinary strengths are in trade and economic relations, but you would, I take it, agree that this would be a big issue, particularly for the Biden administration, which is trying to maintain a balanced relationship with Russia, and that this would be seen by too many as a concession to Russia, and if in fact Germany were to push back hard on the nuclear sharing issue, and thereby endanger a set of arrangements that have been in place for decades.
Oh, for sure. And look, especially coming on top of the Nord Stream 2 decision, gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, which has caused enormous controversy, not only in the United States, but in Europe, is with the nuclear sharing decision. If it were to be taken, it would be, I think, a very disturbing sign, and would be taken as such not only by the White House, but importantly by Congress, which has been extremely active on the gas pipeline issue.
Right. So, Marianne, we'll come to you in 1 second. I just want to drill down a little more with our Germanists on what this coalition is going to look like in the end. It's interesting to watch them all working hard on position papers and on agreeing on what the coalition program will be. But one issue that will be of interest to Americans, I think, of all stripes, is the distribution of important posts. And in this coalition, it seems like the post everyone's most concerned about is who's going to run the finance ministry. We have two leaders from the smaller parties who have laid claim to it. Peter Lindner of the Free Democrats, Robert Habeck of the Greens. The Greens want it because they want to use it as a kind of engine for implementing wide-ranging climate change related policies. Lindner has basically said it's his or there's going to be a big price to pay. And there was a very interesting article by Nobel Prize winner Joe Stiglitz, along with Adam Tooze, on how important the finance ministry is in every aspect of German international policy. We would get two very different finance ministries out of these two different people. Lindner is, I would say, in the tradition of German parsimony or just fiscal discipline. Habeck might have a different view. Any guesses, first of all, Peter, how this is all going to play out?
Well, I think the first important point is at the end, the government has to act as one government. They can't act, there's one finance minister and one foreign minister and one minister, whatever. They have to find compromises. They have to find a common line, a common policy. And this is also valid regarding the very important issue of fiscal discipline. You've mentioned that is important for our European partners. European partners are very much looking on that with different perspectives and different expectations, if not saying hopes. But I think that is one of the crucial points to define the German fiscal policy for the next 4 years. And then, of course, the finance minister will be very important in that game. But it's not only one person, as it has not been just one person during the last years, being that Mr. Scholz himself, or before that, Mr. Schäuble. It's always finding a compromise and a policy line in the whole government. And that is quite difficult for those three parties, where two parties, SPD, Social Democrats and Greens, are more supportive for more investment and spending policy, and the Liberal Party, the Free Democrats, as you mentioned, more focused on fiscal discipline.
Jonathan, anything you wanted to add there?
Sure, I perfectly agree with Peter. What's interesting is, I think, You mentioned this in the beginning, Dan. You know, with three parties in government, we could easily, and I think one can easily make the point that this is going to be a coalition of lowest common denominator, that different parties are and their positions might cancel each other out, and that we won't get to very ambitious policies. I think what is interesting, you mentioned Stiglitz and TUS on one hand. There's the Austrians and the Austrian government even now coming out and saying, you know, we expect Lindner to be the finance minister, and we expect Germany to be part of our alliance for fiscal prudence in Europe that we're building, or that we have built. So you can see that the different parts within Europe and even beyond Europe, the different philosophies are going to be represented. On fiscal policy, on economic policy, are going to be represented in this government if it actually comes into being. And again, this could mean lowest common denominator, but maybe there is an opportunity here, because if we have 27 EU member states, and we all know how divided the EU oftentimes is. If these three parties within Germany come to an agreement on key issues of fiscal and economic policy, then possibly that could be a blueprint, at least if I'm trying to be optimistic, that could be a blueprint for Europe, where the FDP takes into account the Scandinavian positions, SPD and Greens possibly more of the South, or if you want to ascribe that to them. But so I think Lindner will be the finance minister. I don't see how else you could make it work between the three parties, but I think there could be an opportunity in that constellation, actually.
Interesting. So that's a great segue, which is, I believe, a French word. So we'll turn to our French correspondent, Marianne. I want to come back to foreign policy later, or shall we say global policy, but Marianne, why don't you give us a flavor of how the other half of the fabled French-German motor of Europe feels right now about the government that is emerging? Are they hopeful? Are they simply in watch and wait mode? What's the feeling there?
Well, I think my sense is that they have concern with it. And I think that Peter and Jonathan just mentioned the reasons why this coalition might be a problem for Paris, who's regarding, you know, fiscal and finance discipline is not the best pupil of the classroom usually. So having a Peter Lindner as a minister for finance is not absolutely what they dreamt of. And I think my sense is that this coalition is not at all the one that Paris would have voted for if they had to. My sense is that they would have preferred a coalition led by the CDU, and Armin Laschet, with all his weaknesses, would have been a perfect candidate for Paris, I think, because of his weak character, because it was not a very strong personality, which would have been helpful, but also because the CDU is very used to a French-German relationship. Armin Laschet was from the I don't know how you say in English,
The Rhine, yes.
Side, the Rhine side of Germany.
Yeah, right.
It's very near and used to European matters. Well, this didn't happen, and I think that Macron is watching the German coalition with concern, because there are strong contradictions, as you mentioned it, between the three parties, and even if there are these conflicts, they are going to make very German and very serious coalition agreement, and they will make just one government together. I'm sure, and we can be confident in them for that. It will remain a government which is quite unreadable, I think, and will for different reasons. There will be some concerns for the French. It could end up in conflicts with French, for example, with the SPD on the matter of European defense, which is not the main topic of the SPD, and the reason why the thing that is going to fight for. they can go in conflict with Greens on nuclear power, and they can go in conflict with FDP on the Eurozone and financing and with the debt. So for these three reasons, I think this coalition is not at all what Paris would have dreamt of.
Well, setting aside the desire of Paris to have a weak partner in Berlin for a second, shouldn't they be somewhat excited to have the sort of more ambitious, somewhat technocratic counterparts for President Macron?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's challenging, and it's very good for France to have such a very new coalition, and the young generation voted for it, and I think that it's good. But you know, I think that the problem for France is not really the German coalition, but what France is going to happen. And there is a tremendous event which is going to happen in May in France, which is the election. And Macron is absolutely not sure of winning this election. This is absolutely uncertain. And so the future of Macron is uncertain. Then you have another person who is emerging. We are used to focus very much on the French-German couple. It's a sort of because of history, because of the size of the two countries, because it's natural, and because it's the basement of Europe. But there is another person who is emerging, who is Mario Draghi, and Italy's Draghi is a stronger and stronger. Draghi is the strong man of Europe. He saved the euro. He's a sort of a hero in Europe. Is not at all a third and a side person. And I think he's going to enter the game and maybe put a sort of a disorder in the French. In the French-German couple for good. I think it's good because it's new, it's challenging again, and yeah. But the other problem, beside the election, beside Draghi, is that the state of France itself, economically, politically, socially, financially, France is not in a good state, and I'm not sure that the France is going to lead the presidency of the European Union for the first 6 months next year. And I think that is the real difficulty for France, is to remain credible in Europe with all these difficulties.
Yeah. Now you make a great point about Mario Draghi, who has emerged as certainly the most confident leader in Europe right now. And of course, it's a very important point that France is headed towards elections. This is a protracted period in which the two, greatest powers in Europe are somewhat distracted. And Tony, I would ask you, first of all, is this period essentially lasting from late October until next spring? Is this a big problem for Europe, and is it a big problem for the U.S.? Henry Kissinger always said, when I want to call Europe, who do I call? Now it seems like there are even fewer people at the other end of the phone than usual.
Well, there's no alternative really to strong, confident German leadership in Europe. And I remember when I was serving in Brussels, the genuine warmth that there was between President Obama and Chancellor Merkel, and for good reason, because she was often the adult in the room, played a key role, of course, in the financial crisis and dealing with its aftermath, played a key role in rallying our European allies on sanctions, for example, after the invasion of Ukraine, and in many other instances. So there isn't going to be, I think, any alternative German leadership. Look, I spent a lot of time in Italy. I'm actually here today. And of course, of what Mario Draghi is doing, and this country is blessed to have him at the helm. And he's also helped by the fact there's 200 billion euros of EU money. And in order to get that money, the country's going to have to deliver, and he's the one to deliver. So I think he has some stability in his post. But Italy has long-standing and recurring weaknesses, as we all know, economic and political and other. So there's no alternative to Germany. And I think, what what the White House is probably going to be thinking now is we need continued leadership, and we need, if anything, more confident leadership. I say that because Merkel, for all of her wonderful, things that she contributed, did often wait until the last possible moment to take key decisions. And I think that Germany has to step up in so many ways we can discuss later, including, by the way, in its neighborhood, Dan, which is going to be a very important issue. Not only its neighborhood, but internally, how to deal with Hungary and Poland. And then in the neighborhood, how do you deal with Belarus and the Balkans and so forth? I think the White House will also be hoping that Germany will now, depending on whether Christian Lindner is the finance minister, but will use its so-called fiscal space to spend more and to be the motor, economic motor for Europe.
Right, and all important questions, and ones that actually I believe the Wall Street Journal cast out on just yesterday with an article about the problems that the German economy is having right now. So your various comments, it seems to me, lead naturally to the question of the eternal question, whether Europe, in the sense that Angela Merkel is, profoundly admired for her crisis management, and yet, and that crisis management played out on many occasions here in Europe, in the Eurozone crisis, immigration crisis, so on and so forth. I think the question that lots of analysts are pondering right now is, despite the fact that it's a three-legged coalition, is there a chance that actually the new coalition will be more eager to see the European project move forward in a more confident sort of way? Merkel, for all of her many virtues, never really had a big Europe policy except to avoid disaster. And it's also been interesting to watch, we can talk about this later, how the German chattering classes have turned on her as she has been leaving office because she was a great crisis manager, but not a visionary with a program for the future. So, can one hope that this new coalition, driven in large part by younger voters with strong European identities, will want to enhance Europe, strengthen the project, iron out some of the problems that have been dogging the EU? Jonathan, why don't I start with you?
Sure. I think my answer is yes. I think there is a good chance for that, and it would also be my response to Marion, whose points I fully understand. But I think basically, as Dan said, this is a coalition that came or will come into being thanks in good part to young voters. You have a chancellor, a likely chancellor, who talks a lot more about European sovereignty and these kinds of words that we tend to hear from a French president rather than the German chancellor, than the previous chancellor, than the current one, who has said that the issuance of common debt was a Hamiltonian moment for Europe. So I do think, in this sense, there's more of a push for Europe, and I think that is also shared across with the FDP in general. Not on fiscal prudence, they have a different stance, of course, but on building European capacity to act and so forth. I think we can see a much stronger push. At least there's the opportunity for that. And I'll also mention what Dan and Tony have mentioned in their comments. America is currently investing into its strategic competitiveness. China has been for a long time, and you could see even conservative economic institutes in Germany talking about the underinvestment and the need for a much bigger push for modernizing the country. And that is the project at the core of this coalition. And whether they may have different philosophies and they might have to find ways and compromise on how to do the investments, and we'll see if the levels of investments match ambitions. That'll be interesting to watch. The general push for modernizing infrastructure, the country becoming competitive in the current strategic environment economically, I think I wouldn't just underestimate what this is as an opportunity. Whether they'll seize it, we'll see.
Peter, do you agree?
Not in all aspects.
That's why I called on you.
I'm slightly more pessimistic on that, because I think the first very important point is that Angela Merkel, as I said, regarding to the whole government, it's also worth for her. She has not been the only person in government. She's not been the only person in Europe to govern this continent, and she has had to take into account the realities. And I think that will going to be very important also for the new government. And starting with the talk about European sovereignty, it's for sure that President Macron will be happy with that. But it's also very sure that our European neighbors on the eastern side won't be happy with that. And it's also sure that at least in the United States, and maybe you can comment on that, but what I have perceived is that there is expected to take on more responsibility on the European side, and especially on the German side, but not seeking something as a more autonomous or more independent Europe. And that is a very important difference. But there, I think the new government and the new Chancellor has to deal with the realities. And when he sits in Brussels at the table with all the other heads of government and heads of state, he has to negotiate with them. He has to negotiate with Orban, with Kaczynski, or Morawiecki, and also with the prime minister from northern countries and southern countries. So I'm not so optimistic that all these conflicts will disappear just because we in Germany have a new government which has been voted for by the young generation. And maybe one aspect on Germany, and there it's also important to take into account the realities. This government has not been voted for because of international policies, European policies, security policies. There are many other aspects which have been much more important, like climate change, pandemic. There's a fear in Germany of problems with economy and with migration, etc. But all the aspects which are important on that international level with the United States, with other global partners and within the European Union have not been discussed during the campaign. So there's not a mandate where you can say, well, this government, Mr. Scholz, has the mandate to do this or that on the European level.
Now, you bring up a really fascinating point about the election, which was that you could go days without hearing anything about foreign policy, which was quite fascinating. Maybe we'll change topics here for a moment, and I'll turn to you, Tony, and say, what do you think the hopes are in Washington from the new government, and from what will come out on the other side of all this tumult in Europe in the middle of 22 or a little later?
Well, Dan, the point I think was very well made, that foreign policy is rarely a key factor in elections, including the United States. It's usually a very minor factor. But I think there will be some hope, reasonable hope, that this government will be more robust, let's put it that way, with regard to China, particularly in raising human rights issues, perhaps even more willing to engage with the United States on a range of issues that are now being discussed with the EU on the Trade and Technology Council, which are very much in Germany's lane. Everything from export controls to supply chain diversification to how we deal with both the online platforms regulation and also setting standards, very relevant, by the way, in terms of how we deal with the Chinese challenge in setting standards for our products worldwide. And here I'm thinking particularly of facial recognition, video surveillance, and so on, which have obviously a key impact on our common values. So I think there's going to be some modest hope there. Clearly, the green agenda, there's going to be a lot of hope that that Germany will be a major player together with the EU. I think there's can be some hope, although perhaps significant, given that China is really the big issue now between the US and Europe. Some hope that that Germany will be a bit more robust, I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of Hungary and Poland, and ensuring that the EU lives up to its values. And that's important because a Europe that doesn't live up to its own values can't project those values in its own neighborhood. I think that you know, on energy independence as well, I think there may be some movement here. Nord Stream is probably a fait accompli, but I think this is a joint interest here that Europe diversifies its sources and routes of gas into the country. So on all of those issues, I think there's hope of some movement, and Germany is an essential player in ensuring that we can protect and project our values, particularly with regard to China. And the last thing I'll say here, Dan, is I'm slightly concerned that this administration doesn't quite see Europe as a key player in dealing with China. And I think it's a mistake. I've written about this. I think the EU has some core unique values and assets they can bring to bear on all the topics I mentioned. But I think the people who are really calling the shots today in Washington are the China experts who are looking for allies in the Asia Pacific to advance our interests.
I'm going to follow up on that and maybe press you a bit. You know, if you talk to, shall we say, the expert in the street here in Berlin, the two issues that come up in the transatlantic context over the last year, Afghanistan and the submarines, the shift from the French submarines to Anglo-American submarines being sold to the Australians. And that has given rise, and you and I have talked about this before, to sort of two schools of thought. One is that America doesn't care that much about European reaction, or America simply has a new team that has been stumbling a bit, and as you said, because of the primacy of the China issue, maybe hasn't been focusing on appropriate diplomatic hygiene as it might have in the past. Which camp are you falling into?
I hope these are just hiccups, but let's be clear that over many administrations, including the Obama administration, for which I served, there were always those who questioned the ability of Europe to be an effective actor on a lot of these topics, and certainly an actor that was able to be quick. So there's always been some frustration. We're seeing, I think, it now. Some believing that, as I mentioned, allies such as Australia, such as Japan and Korea and Taiwan, and in some cases India, can deliver faster and better on issues of importance. And I think, as I mentioned, it's a mistake. It's a mistake because for all of its flaws and its slow, you know, its inability to act quickly, the EU is actually a superpower, certainly on trade, on regulatory issues. And within the EU, Germany is obviously the key player. So I hope, Dan, these are hiccups because the EU can deliver. Now, both the Afghanistan withdrawal and the AUKUS deal, the submarine deal you mentioned with Australia, I think it doesn't help. It doesn't help because there are many voices now in Europe saying, well, actually, this is the third administration in a row that doesn't really value Europe. The French are now emboldened in their quest for strategic autonomy. And it just doesn't feed the right narrative.
Very well put. So you touched on the biggest issue on the global agenda, at least to most people. I'm sure that there's some who would disagree, but Jonathan, do you see a materially different China policy coming out of the new coalition? You know, it's worth mentioning at this point that at least the common wisdom is that Germans voted for Olaf Scholz because he was the candidate most like Angela Merkel, which is to say a candidate for consensus and for continuity. But against that backdrop, what do you think about China policy?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, especially how you framed it, because you asked about a materially different China policy. What I do think we will see is a more of an emphasis in rhetoric, at least, on values and human rights than has been the case in the past. I think the Greens are very clear on that. And who knows, may or may not. I mean, she may not be as interested anymore. But for some time we were thinking Annalena Baerbock would also become the foreign minister. So I think in terms of ambition to have a slightly more of a value-based foreign policy on China, I think we will see a little more. The question is what are they actually going to do in terms of political resources to back that up, and is there, as you mentioned, is there a willingness then in the Chancellery to take that different course, or a slightly? I mean, I think in any case we're talking about a slightly different course because we all know the economic ties that there are, and that this is, if anything, a mid to long-term strategic goal to diversify away from China and so forth. But maybe we'll see a few steps. But I think mostly rhetoric, and the question is then very concretely when it comes to the next round of, possibly transatlantic sanctions, does Germany then dare to, and other Europeans to go along with the US if there were more sanctions like the ones back in March?
Right. Okay. Peter, if I can sort of take a twist on that question. I was talking to a senior German diplomat recently who was exasperated by the perception that Germany and the United States are far apart on China. And this diplomat was a representative of the school that the journalists may depict it as being very far apart on China, but it's not as big a gap as you would think. And that in fact, if you look at the statistics, the US continues to invest more in China than Germany. What's your view on this situation? Are we in fact closer aligned than we give ourselves credit for?
No, really, I don't think that. I think we have a certain gap on China, but I agree with all what Jonathan just said, and I would just add that we have seen a slight shift in our German and European view on China during the last 2 years. There have been documents and declarations of business associations, the German Business Association, but also the European Union, seeing or showing more awareness on the character of the Chinese regime. But I'm convinced, and I fear that, but I'm convinced that that won't be enough to meet the United States expectations. I think we have still not the ability and not the political will, not in those three parties preparing a new government, and not in the CDU party to go very much aligned with the United States policies. And I think that is difficult for us and for our transatlantic relationship, and issues like AUKUS are not helpful on that, because they strengthen the mistrust, the existing mistrust in Europe versus or the mistrust for the US administration. After Trump, many had expected that we would get back on track. I think all the experts said no, their interests much more important than just one administration. And we see that that is the fact that the Biden administration has also China on its focus. But here the mistrust has been relevant, and with AUKUS and other decisions, it won't disappear. So I'm very skeptical on the future transatlantic relationship regarding China, and in the German case, especially regarding also Russia, because Nord Stream 2 has been mentioned, and we have now in the government the Greens and the Liberals, which are much more critical on human rights issues, but we have the leading force, the Social Democratic Party, and the new, or probably new chairman of the Social Democratic Party, Lars Klingbeil, is somebody very much linked personally and politically to Gerhard Schröder, our former chancellor, now serving on the Russian side. So I think there will be much more potential for conflicts than we would like to have.
Tony, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, all I'll say here is that we spend too much time talking about what separates us. And it's inevitable we're going to have different views, partly because Europe, with the exception of France, has very much less at stake in the Pacific than we do. But let's be clear, there are areas where we align, and it's obvious in protecting sensitive technologies, in elaborating what is a trustworthy and responsible AI set of policies, in setting standards. And if we don't act on those areas and some others, then let's be very clear. We will be living in a world where there is a Beijing effect instead of a Brussels effect. The Brussels effect is essentially the exporting of rules and standards thanks to a single market. And the United States also exporting its rules and standards thanks to the importance of its economy. And if we don't cooperate in those areas, we will be living in a China-dominated world. So all I'm saying here, Dan, is that if we don't actually focus, laser focus, very fast on the perhaps few areas where we actually align, I think there have to be more than few, there are going to be consequences to play. And I think Europe is more exposed than we are. I think we should be brutally honest in this way. And if we don't enter into a partnership, as I said, it's going to be a shame.
Well, the experience of the elections with third parties meddling or second parties meddling in the infosphere here in Germany was certainly a reminder of that. Jonathan, I get the feeling that the tides are turning on public discussion of both Russia and China. Is that your view? That is to say, German attitudes are coming closer to American attitudes on these issues. But what do you think?
I think so, yeah, and I think I mean, at least in the discourse, and at least in terms of awareness of the sorts of things that are going on in Xinjiang, and I think there is a sort of different perception of what China represents. There's less of a feeling, I think, in Germany that it is the big strategic competitor that's threatening, German hegemony, because there's no German hegemony in the same sense that there is for the US, and that is a difference in point of view. But I think there's a clear sense that the closest partner outside of Europe and the closest partner in general, possibly with the exception of France, are on the same level of France, and you can debate that, is the United States, and that the US has a lot of very important points that are viewed similarly. Tony has mentioned them, on tech, on standards, and the kind of world we want to live in the next decades. And Peter has mentioned that what's interesting is that there is a sort of awakening, and has been for a few years, in the business community as well, at least in parts, and in important parts, with position papers that have come out on China. And there's a shift going on, I feel, where you're not looking at short-term interests, which is getting, selling stuff in China to a more mid to long term interest. Look, where interests are much more aligned with the US. And where it's just in your own self-interest to have a diversified trade relations, to not have Chinese standards governing, trade or shaping technologies and so forth. So I think so, yes. We may be slightly behind the US on this, but.
Ryan, do you want to address the view from Paris on this constellation of issues and how Europe might come together and where there might be common ground?
Yeah, I think that in that matter, Merkel was an artist, because she was an artist and very skillful in putting people together, putting contradictions together, and people who don't speak together usually together. And to me, I used to say that she's the ancestor of the en même temps, the Macronian en même temps. She does things at the same time. And for example, she was skillful enough to put Germany in independence of Russia and of China, together with speaking out for the rights, the human rights, and together and being together the favorite NATO European member of the United States. And so I think that, as you said, all of you, the fact that the US, with the withdrawal of the US from the European scene, is a chance for a stronger Europe now. And with the Greens and the SPD together, there might be a shift in this favor. In the meanwhile, I think that you have this debate, the Macron made up this concept of European sovereignty, and the Germans don't like it. They prefer, strategic autonomy, and the Germans prefer European sovereignty because they think that strategic autonomy raises too many expectations, and France is known as being very lyrical in their ambitions. So Merkel didn't like that, and Germans don't like that. But I think that it's not so much in contradiction, and that no member state seriously thinks that they can have defense independently from the NATO, and nobody thinks that a European defense is able to protect, for example, the Baltic countries from an attack by their own. So I think that NATO is not in question at all, and I'm not sure that there will be such a shift with the new government, because they will have to be to remain realistic with China, unfortunately, with China and Russia, and it will depend on the US. Will the US consider Germany as the favorite of the NATO members or not? And I think it's in the hands of the US.
Okay,
finally.
Well, we have Europe putting the burden back on the US for getting things right. I think Tony might feel a little differently about who should be taking all the steps, but let's just stipulate for the record that both sides are on the hook to do something if they're going to make this relationship vital and important. Marianne, maybe as we come towards a close, we could just take 1 minute to look back on the Merkel era, which you've written a biography of her about. Do you see Merkel as a figure who has positioned Europe well for the future, and whose legacy of good cooperation with the United States in particular, through thick and thin, and sometimes through extraordinarily thin, is a usable past for Europeans? Are we in a good place for the future, or do you see reason for concern?
Well, yes, she's not. Merkel was not a natural European. I mean, she came from the East. She came to me, she was exceptional by the fact that she comes from a country that doesn't exist anymore, which is East Germany, and this makes her absolutely different and absolutely special and unique. And I think that this origin led her to understand better than any other leader in the world some values, even though she very often put stability and economic power over values, but she's a valued person fundamentally, and I think that she learned these values from her Eastern experience, the experience of the dictatorship. For example, she knows better than any other what freedom means. She knows better than any other what unity means, and this, I think that Zusammenhalten that she made with the eastern part of Europe was very important to her, and stability. She experienced the wall falling and the world being all different from one day to another. So I think that all these values, she really understood them better than any other. But she's not a European. She was not familiar to France. She comes from a part of Europe which was separated from the other. So and her experience in Europe was when she came into power in 2005. The enlargement had happened, the big enlargement of 2004, and so the Europe was very, very different to what it was in the basis with the six founding members. She didn't know all of that, so she's a marketeer. She's a free trader. I mean, and but she learned something. In the end, she had some. She's not a reforming person, so we know that she lived, and she installed the economic power thanks to the reforms of Gerhard Schröder. But she knew how to lead the sick man of Europe, which was Germany, to the first European economic power, and she succeeded in that. And she had some instinctive actions, very, very dramatic and spectacular actions. First with the refugees, first with Fukushima when she stopped the nuclear, but this was a very politician thing, I think. But with the migrants, she had something very spectacular, and she saved to my eyes, she saved the honor of all Europe at the time. And the last thing that she did for Europe was this historic recovery plan together with Emmanuel Macron. And suddenly she led Germany to give up all these taboos, like the Schwarze Null, the financial and fiscal austerity. She gave up in very important things, and in that sense, I think she made a step forward, and she led Germany to a new history. She helped Germany to create a new history.
Okay, we're coming to the very, very end of our time, so I'm just going to ask for 20-second responses from our other panelists. Merkel positioning Europe well for a transatlantic future. Jonathan?
I think generally yes. I think on China we've said it before, but I think she could have done more. And I think overall, sometimes I think we would need a little bit more ambition, or if there's something that Germany or Europeans don't like in the US approach, then one can make an alternative proposal and then find common ground. That's possibly what was lacking, but generally speaking, I think yes.
Yeah, I think yes. In spite of all the crises, she has kept Europe together, and I think that's in the interest of Europe and in the interest of the United States.
Tony, final thoughts?
Well, very quickly, I think history will be kind to her. Of course, for anyone who's been in power for so long, there will be criticisms. And for me, the top of the criticisms will be that she did not prepare the country for the digital revolution, in my view. And I think the post-Fukushima decision to shut nuclear reactors has proven to be seriously counterproductive in terms of Germany's emissions. And at the same time, the German taxpayers were saddled with high costs for renewables. Taking that decision was inexplicable in my view. But in terms of transatlantic relations, very positive. Look, she did a lot to support the trade agreement that we never got, as you recall, Dan, the famous TTIP, Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement. She's always pushed for settling of disputes, either economic or political. So she will be missed, and I think her record was a positive one.
Okay. Well, we are at the end of our time. We're indeed past the end of our time. So I'm just going to say thank you very much for joining us. It's been a terrific conversation, and goodbye from Berlin.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Very interesting conversation and an incredible panel we put together. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to share your wisdom with us. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We have a couple of other interesting webinars scheduled on November 17th, EU Economic Update, a discussion if the Recovery and Resilience Fund will be a game changer for the EU economy. December 6th, Transatlantic Collaboration on EV batteries, and December 9th, our annual real estate update, which will be an in-person event. And we will be uploading the recording of this discussion to our YouTube channel, and the link will be available on the EACC website. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Daniel, for moderating, and to our panel, just absolutely fantastic. Really, really enjoyed the conversation.